Hey everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time reacting to the Battle of Lobositz, 1756, the Outbreak of the 7 Years' War by House of History. And yes, I'm continuing on with this series about Frederick the Great. And if you haven't seen my reaction to the other episodes in this series about Frederick the Great, I suggest you check them out before checking this one out. And so yeah, judging by the title, we're looking at the Prussian side of things during the 7 Years' War, because, excuse me, when you talk about the 7 Years' War, if my memory is right, it talks about the French and the British with their hands around each other's necks, as always, or at each other's throats, again, for the millionth time. So it'll be an interesting thing to see the Prussian or European side of things on what was happening on the European theatre. So the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. So with out of the way, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to House of History, check out their content. They're another top tier history channel here on YouTube. So, and they deserve as much credit as everyone can give them. So, without rambling on too long, let's get this up on screen and see how this goes. Battle of Lobositz, 7 Years' War.
It was around 6 a.m. as a thick layer of mist covered the Elbe plain that morning of October 1st, 1756. Frederick the Great's army marched onwards between the hills. Neither the king nor his generals could make out what awaited them behind the foggy marshes. All they knew was that the enemy was close. Unbeknownst to them, Austrian Field Marshal Maximilian Ulysses Brown had deployed his numerically superior army much earlier, fully expecting to meet the Prussians here. He had enough time to deploy his entire army, proven by the rustling of leaves on the hill next to Frederick's army. Little did the Prussians know that General Franz Moritz von Lacy and 2,000 hidden irregular troops were more than ready for the battle to commence. Tensions between Prussia and other European great powers remained high after the minor kingdoms' stunning victories of the First and the Second Silesian War. A decade of international developments detailed in my video dedicated to the so-called diplomatic revolution followed. By
Which I've already reacted to.
1756, Frederick learned of an anti-Prussian alliance against him. He tried his best to navigate the muddled geopolitical waters. Then, on a whim, he decided to sign a treaty with Britain, the arch-enemy of his main ally in continental Europe, France.
Yeah, Hanover was a British territory, because if people know about British or English history, that I think the latest the monarchy that we've got now is in direct line with the House of Hanover, if I remember rightly. I might have mixed that up a little bit, but I might have got that wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Queen Elizabeth, her family is from the House of Hanover originally.
Perhaps ironically, this treaty, meant to guarantee its safety, led to the rapid deterioration of Prussia's situation.
Wow.
In response, France moved into Austria's embrace, and Russia was already preparing a war against the kingdom. In the months following the treaty signing, France and Austria concluded the defensive First Alliance of Versailles. Austrian Minister Kaunitz, the chief architect of rapprochement with the arch-enemy France.
Wait, hang on. Louis the 15th. Yeah. Yeah, because I believe that most of the French Bourbon family from Louis the 15th and 16th. I think their wives were Austrians. And if I remember rightly, Marie Theresa was the first female solo monarch that ruled overall, because usually monarchs, they would never usually allow a queen or an empress to rule solo. It was always kings or emperors, the male side of things. So this was a break from tradition. As I said, if I got that wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments below.
Minister Kaunitz, the chief architect of rapprochement with the arch-enemy France, also established an alliance with Sweden by promising them to return Pomerania upon Prussia's defeat.
Swedish Pomerania.
Three great powers all vying to destroy the kingdom rightly unnerved Frederick. At first he tried to use diplomacy to determine their exact plans, but none of the courts even pretended to assure him that they would not attack him. So finally, Frederick decided to use his trusted recipe, which granted him success in the first two Silesian wars. He decided to strike first.
Wow.
He set his eyes on Saxon. And why Saxon? Well, once again, the policy was based on Frederick's mistaken assumptions. He thought Saxony joined the anti-Prussian alliance, which they had not. However, whether it was justified, his invasion provided him with a strategic advantage. None of his primary adversaries had mobilized close to his borders. By conquering Saxony, he prevented Austria, France, and Russia from establishing a springboard only 80 kilometers away from his capital.
Wow.
After conquering the electorate, he wanted to cross into Bohemia and capture Prague before winter fell. Thanks to Saxony's abundance of resources and decent economic infrastructure, Frederick would be able to subsidize a significant portion of the upcoming war through Saxony. It would turn out to be true. During the entire 7 Years' War, Saxony funded up to 1/3 of Prussia's expenses. In August 1756, Frederick deployed his army on the Saxon border. On that misty morning, he marched into the unsuspecting electorate. Immediately, things did not go the way Frederick anticipated. Whereas he expected a quick and swift victory, the Saxons evaded the invading Prussian army. They took up their defensive position in the fortress of Pirna, described as one of the most tactically strong positions in Central Europe. The Saxons' resistance was significant enough to delay Frederick's timetable. On September 9, he finally captured Dresden, but was already behind on schedule. The international response to, and the surprise by his illegitimate invasion, was not mild. To show how unexpected the invasion was, Maria Theresa was at her country retreat at Holich when news of the advancing Prussian army reached her. She immediately returned to Vienna and coordinated a surprisingly swift response. 11 days later, Field Marshal Maximilian Ulysses von Braun, commanding the main Austrian army, reached Budin in northern Bohemia. His objective was to relieve the Saxons at Pirna. However, meanwhile, Frederick was already advancing into Bohemia with his main army, leaving a Prussian garrison behind his lines to keep Pirna under siege. Near the village of Lobositz, in the valley of the river
Lobositz, I did pronounce it right.
Frederick's main armies ran into each other.
Oops.
At
Sorry.
6 a.m. in the early morning of
I forgot to do my usual thing when I put these videos up, is put the captions on.
October 1st, 1756, Frederick's army marched into the Elbe plain. Braun had chosen this location to halt the Prussian advance. He fielded 34,000 troops, 26,500 infantry in 15 regiments, 4 Croat battalions, 7,500 cavalry in 12 regiments and 94 guns. He deployed his Austrian army from the north to the south of Lobositz. The central part of his infantry was situated behind the Mödelbach, with infantry and cavalry deployed relatively scattered between the Elbe and the stream. In the
They look like
village of
really good
Sulowitz,
defensive positions.
lay several hidden infantry units and artillery pieces. Finally, in front of Lobositz stood Austrian artillery. These artillery units had received a massive overhaul during the interbellum, and this battle was the first time Prussia faced them. They would definitely notice. The river protected Brown's left flank, the low bush protected his right. He had the strategic high ground, for sure. Frederick initially believed he was only facing a minor Austrian rearguard, covering their crossing of the Elbe. Frederick commanded around 28,500 soldiers, 17,500 infantry in 25 battalions, 10,500 horses in 59 squadrons, 97 artillery guns, and a small force of 300 hussars. Frederick and Brunswick and about 10 artillery guns seized the Homolka, an excellent observation point to direct the battle. It is uncertain at which stage Frederick realized he faced the main army. Many sources indicate he was unaware of his foe's superior numbers until after the battle commenced. As the Prussians arrived, General Lacy, commanding around 2,000 Hungarian and Croat irregulars, made his way around the low bush, intending to fall onto the Prussian army from an elevated position. As soon as the Prussian infantry entered the Elbe Valley, the Austrian artillery positioned in front of Lobositz opened fire on them.
Wow.
The Prussian artillery returned fire in response. Though unknown whether Frederick noticed Lacy's outflanking maneuver, he ordered August Wilhelm, Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, and his entire Prussian left flank to seize the Lobusch Hill. The infantry began the climb. They ran into Lacy's irregulars on top, and heavy combat ensued. Due to the uneven terrain, the combat was not orderly, and infantry was scattered around, fighting for their lives. Frederick ordered Lieutenant General Friedrich Wilhelm von Kiau's cuirassiers to scout the valley and expose Brown's center and left positions. Frederick still considered the army he faced a minor force, although Kiau warned the king that the fog may hold more than the king imagined. Kiau split up his cavalry, with part moving against Sulowitz and its infantry, part against Lobositz. Skirmishes erupted in front of Sulowitz, while Kiau continued towards Lobositz. Austrian dragoons exploited the emerging gap by flanking Kiau's cavalry. A savage skirmish evolved, slowly moving towards Lobositz. Then, suddenly, the Austrian cavalry commander ordered to disengage. The Prussians found themselves close to ditches from which Croat irregulars emerged. These opened fire against the surprised cavalry. Strategically hidden artillery to their west joined the murderous fire. Then, the dragoons re-engaged, crashing into Kiau. The Prussian cavalry deteriorated into a chaotic and unorganized rout. At a terrible cost, the cavalry at Sulowitz attempted to protect them, to no avail. As they fell back, the fog cleared, and for the first time Frederick saw the extent of his enemy, stretched from the Mühlbach to Velhoten. He ordered the remainder of the cavalry to link up, but to hold off on their second charge. Combined, they numbered approximately 10,000. Despite their orders to wait, the continuous shelling by the Austrian artillery caused its commanders to become impatient and unnerved. This culminated in an uncoordinated charge by the Prussian cavalry. They charged towards Lobositz, uncertain where the enemy was positioned and how many there were. But again, soldiers behind the Mühlbach, hidden artillery in Sulowitz, and the regulars around the ditches picked them off as they clashed with the Austrian dragoons. Still, the impact and their advance unnerved Brown. He ordered the cavalry behind the Mühlbach to charge the flank of the Prussians, which they did. They caught them hard. Within minutes, most regiments lost over 100 men, including dozens of officers. When the Austrian infantry around Lobositz opened fire, the horsemen, fortunate enough to survive until now, realized their efforts would bear no results, and they fell back to the infantry line. During all this, the fight on the Lobusch against Lacy was still ongoing. Despite outnumbering the Austrians, Bevern required multiple reinforcements. Due to the lack of ammunition, soldiers on the hill resorted to looting fallen comrades to continue firing.
Wow.
The rest of the infantry had remained relatively quiet throughout the entire battle, similarly to Brown's main army behind the Mühlbach. But in the background, Brown had been frantically preparing his infantry to move onto Sulowitz. Then, with a large part of his army already drawn up, the Prussian artillery on the top of the Homolka unleashed hell on them. The village was reduced to a burning pile of rubble, and the army was pushed back over the bridges. Regardless of fending off the main army's attack, trouble brewed behind the Prussian front lines. The howitzers on the Homolka were running low on ammunition.
Hang on. Sorry, I had to turn off my fan.
And the battle on the hill was costly, but stagnant. Around this moment, Frederick handed over command to Field Marshal James Keith and ordered him to consider retreat as he left the battlefield. Frankly, Prussia's prospects were not that good. The scene was slightly reminiscent of the Battle of Mollwitz 15 years before, when Frederick abandoned the battlefield after the Austrians routed his cavalry. But then Prussia's fortune changed. On top of the low bush, fighting had deteriorated to savage hand-to-hand musket butt and bayonet fighting. The slopes were covered with corpses, but Bevern did come out on top. He pushed Lacy's irregulars off the hill. Exhausted, they fled towards Velhoten and Lobositz.
Wow.
The subsequent interplay on the Prussian side was nothing short of exquisite. Keith ordered the Prussian left to charge in Lobositz's direction. The right was to defend the Homolka in case of a counterattack. He also sent a messenger to Frederick to inform him of their change in fortune. The Prussian infantry put up a brutal fight against the Austrians between Lobositz and Velhoten. The fighting was fierce and ruthless, but they soon pushed through as their artillery lit up Lobositz. The Prussians advanced and picked off whatever infantry remained in the burning village. All houses were on fire as the infantry moved from house to house. Most Habsburg troops jumped in the Elbe in the hopes of escaping. Some fled to the west towards the other side of the Modelbach. Pursuing them was impossible, for the fresh Austrian infantry on the other side launched volleys against the Prussians. It showed the Prussians hadn't decisively won, but they certainly hadn't lost. Understanding his precarious position, Brown ordered the general retreat for the main army behind the Modelbach. The battle had lasted over 9 hours. Once again, the artillery and cavalry combat proved inconclusive. It was the Prussian infantry saving the day. The Prussians suffered 2,906 casualties, whereas the Austrians suffered 3,291. The Prussian army camped on the field of battle. In his letters after the battle, Frederick recounted how the Prussians routed the over twice more numerous Austrian army. But of course, this was not the entire truth. In fact, despite perhaps traditionally emerging victorious, perhaps Brown has to be credited with at least fighting to a draw. He voluntarily withdrew and suffered a similar number of casualties, but he had commanded a larger force. Perhaps more importantly, the Habsburg army was not as easily defeated as had been the case during the 2 Silesian wars beforehand. Frederick realized the army he faced was wildly different from that a decade earlier, writing,
It could be because defeat can be a good teacher.
in a report detailing the battle, that the Austrians are more cunning than formerly, and you can take it from me that if we cannot put much heavier cannon against them, it would cost innumerable lives to beat them. The taking of the Low Bush was reminiscent of the assault against the Granergruppe back in 1745 at the Battle of Soor. This was an incredibly costly affair, but ultimately proved crucial in securing a victory. A few days after the battle, Brown personally commanded 8,000 Austrian soldiers pushing north towards the region where he agreed to meet the Saxon garrison. They were supposed to break out and meet him there, but the Saxons were unable to do so, and on October 14, over 15,000 soldiers surrendered to the Prussians. Despite this setback for the Austrians, the 6-week delay meant that Brown and his army quartered in Prague for the winter, while Frederick was stuck in Dresden. A surviving account from one of the Prussian officers participating in the battle reveals a lot about what Prussia and Frederick were up against. On this occasion, Frederick did not come up against the same kind of Austrians he had beaten in 4 battles in a row. He was not dealing with people like Nijperk or the blustering Prince Charles of Lorraine. He faced Field Marshal Brown, who had grown grey in the service and whose talent and experience had raised him to be one of the heroes of his time. He faced artillery which Prince Liechtenstein had brought to perfection at his own expense. He faced an army which during 10 years of peace had attained a greater mastery of the arts of war and had striven to adopt the methods of its former victors and shape itself according to their discipline.
Mm-hmm.
As for the Saxon,
which, for example, like, instead of, like, the infantry square, the Austrians usually favoured the battalion mass.
Frederick conscripted all of them into the Prussian army. 10 entire new regiments were formed. But perhaps unexpectedly, the desertion among these troops was incredibly high.
Yeah.
Within a few months, 2 regiments were already disbanded because of their rebellious nature, not to mention individual desertions. For now, it was winter, but both sides knew the new year would be filled with combat and warfare. Thank you very much for watching this video. If there's a topic, battle, or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment.
I'll do it. It's been another interesting episode in this series about Frederick the Great. Excuse me. And there's not much more I can add to that. So if you like this reaction, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.